Today we are talking about beta test rankings, and what has already been compiled and ready to go are the results of the healers in these past couple of days, Thursday and Friday, where we got a couple of heroic bosses and even 3 bosses testable on Mythic difficulty. What's interesting about this round of testing is that Holy Paladin has been nerfed in its strongest hero talent, Herald of the Sun, so we get to see now perhaps a more balanced version of Holy Paladin. So with this being said, what you're seeing right now were the first sets of tests done a couple of weeks ago. We saw Holy Paladin and Mistweaver being the overall best performers by quite a bit. Then in the mid though, still quite powerful, you had Resto Shaman and Evoker, and then the consistent 3 bottom specs being Holy Priest, Discipline Priest and Restoration Druid, and this was up to 2 weeks ago. Now, after a couple of weeks, after Holy Paladin being nerfed, what do we see, for example, in the first couple of heroic bosses? Well, what do we see in general still is Paladin and Mistweaver being the best performers, starting with definitely overall being the best one, Holy Paladin. And what a surprise, they are still playing with Herald of the Sun. You know, even if Herald of the Sun was nerfed by like 40 to 50% on Dawnlight and Sun's Avatar, that doesn't matter. It is still by far the best healer in the beta so far. Most of this power, as proved by the nerf to Dawnlight and Sun's Avatar, is in Eternal Flame. Many of the Holy Paladin builds are getting so powered up by Eternal Flame and the power of the ability itself, much improved compared to Word of Glory. Now you also have the hot left behind by your single target spender, that many of them are abandoning almost all traces of you being a caster, you know, things taken before to buff your Flesh of Light or your Holy Light, for example. Even cooldowns like Hand of Divinity, some builds even abandoning Tears Deliverance as well. Going down the right side now for the new Light of the Martyr and Bestow Light to basically make your Holy Shock even stronger. That seems to be one of the default power levels of Holy Paladin with the new upgraded single target spender. It does become, in some cases, a bit repetitive where you get to spam a couple of buttons. If you still play with your single target cast ability, you can add Holy Light, but in many other situations, it really just becomes a Holy Shock spam into use Eternal Flame as a spot heal and to put down a hot on targets. For now, this is the new reality of Holy Paladin, which even after the nerfs continues to do well. However, who did not even get nerfed whatsoever and is still performing quite well, even starting to get into mythic bosses like Olgrax, it's Mistweaver. Mistweaver hasn't really changed that much, as we mentioned from Dragonflight Season 4. They do spend now more time benefiting from Enveloping Mist rather than their spread Renewing Mist and then put down Invigorating Mist to splash heal through Soothing Mist targeting. Now that is still being done quite often, but the power of Enveloping Mist is taking over. Just look, for example, into going the Mistweaver Talent 3 and looking for Enveloping Mist and look at how many things do you get. There is a lot of synergy to be found for Enveloping Mist, starting from free application of Renewing Mist on targets, and when you get Renewing Mist you have a chance to also apply Enveloping Mist, and then through Rising Mist you can extend the duration of both by 4 seconds. So lots of Enveloping Mist, which is practically the best heal over time in the game of spells without a massive cooldown. 312% spell power over 6 seconds, which becomes even higher because it also puts on the target a 30% more healing increase from other spells. And then applying Enveloping Mist also applies Renewing Mist for 6 seconds to an ally within 40 yards, which can then also apply Enveloping Mist again. So you have this endless cycle, which makes Enveloping Mist very powerful. The only one main addition, really, is actually some extra burst healing, which perhaps has been one of the weakest points of Mistweaver out of this, constant powerful hot. You only had a few other buttons, Yulon, Revival, but, compared to other major cooldowns of other healers, was perhaps lagging behind a bit. Thankfully now, you can play with Conduit of the Celestials, which does give you now a pretty powerful cooldown to use. So when you go and check out the Mistweaver, you can clearly see the bumps in the healing that get quite high are pretty much all given to you thanks to Celestial Conduit. Those are perhaps the two new extra powers to Mistweaver in the beta, both the higher power of Enveloping Mist and also the new cooldown. What, however, beats both in terms of power is your obscene amount of mana at your disposal. In a almost 8-minute fight, your mana T is giving you 7 million mana. You have a Holy Priest getting, 8 to 900,000 mana in almost 8 minutes. You have a Holy Paladin getting practically nothing in 8 minutes. You have a Resto Shaman, which is getting about 1.6 million mana back, compared to the 7+ million of a Mistweaver Monk. So it's easy to have consistent and high healing overall if you don't have to worry about your mana nearly as much as the other healers. Talking about other healers, the other one who has been doing quite well across this new round of testing, from the heroic bosses down into the mythic bosses overall, is Preservation Evoker. Now, overall, Preservation Evoker is the best healer, not really because of the performance, which is still quite good, but not beating Mistweaver or Holy Paladin. It's the best because of the sheer amount of variety at its disposal. You see, this build is focusing more on Temporal Anomaly to then use Verdant Embrace and heal a lot with Lifebind, the buff that you get after using Verdant Embrace. And this one is playing with Chronomancer, and you have way more plays around Living Flame as a spot heal. Then you have a different build, which this time uses most of its Temporal Anomaly to heal with Reversion. Then you have a different build, which this time uses Blossom build, and then for spot healing uses Living Flame. And then you have another build that still uses Emerald Blossom, but plays around Engulf. It plays around Flame Shaper as a hero talent. So you have a Blossom build that can play with Flame Shaper, another Blossom build that can play with Chrono Warden, you have the typical Reversion build that can play with Chrono Warden. So in general, given the high results of multiple different specs, Preservation Evoker is definitely the more versatile out of all of the healers in terms of builds, in terms of options, and the performance is also very good at the moment. Another performance that has been quite good overall was the one of Resto Shaman. However, we can't really mention too much about Resto Shaman because, as we have known from Blizzard from a few days ago, they are going to receive some changes. So it's hard to mention, how well Restoration is doing now, or what are their powers, if in just a couple of days, 3 days even, by Tuesday, we will get the new build in the beta of the War Within with more changes to Restoration Shaman. So for now, we have to leave a question mark next to the performance of Resto Shaman until after we have seen the effects of the changes. We have to, however, now repeat what we talked about roughly 10 days ago concerning the worst performers, because the first time we looked at this through heroic testing, the bottom 3 consistently on practically every single boss in heroic was the trio of Discipline, Holy, and Restoration Druid. Now we are into the next round of testing of the last couple of days, and the bottom 3 are Holy, Discipline, and Resto Druid, again on every single boss. So the problem of Holy Priest and the problem of Restoration Druid is mostly numerical, in the sense that the rotation and the build are already there. It's just that the numbers are too low. When it comes to Resto Druid, they do have consistent healing. They don't have powerful cooldowns. You see these peaks of healing getting close to 2 million HPS. This is a Discipline Priest, and they are breaking 2 million, 3 million, and even 4 million HPS. That's because they have burst. Restoration Druid, not nearly as much. What is perhaps a weaker part of their build is that at the moment they don't really have an option to move away of Keeper of the Grove, to move away from a build that plays around and buffs your Grove Guardians, because your other option is practically a Mythic plus build for more damage and for shape-shifting, etc., which doesn't work nearly as well in the raid. And the other problem being how your rotation, your playstyle is still practically identical to right now in Dragonflight. You still spam rejuvenation like crazy. You still pull off your Growth Guardians, you cast your regrowths whenever they are free or empowered, and then you do your Swiftmend Wild Growth combo after ramping up with your rejuves so that you can extend them all with Flourish, or you can turn into Tree of Life every once in a while from Incarnation or from your 3 casts of Swiftmend. So you have this cyclical build, but the HPS in general is quite consistent. You don't have that many bursts of healing. So the main issue when it comes to Resto Druid is just needing some buffs to your overall healing to get closer to here. This is a problem that is very similar to the problem of Holy Priest. They have slightly more peaks of healing, still not very high compared to burst specs, but they have more cooldowns at their disposal, from Salvation to Divine Hymn, and now even with Halo. You can see here the peaks of Halo in pretty much every single spike of healing given to them from Halo. The build itself is still satisfying to play, it flows well, you know, you are weaving in and out of different procs or different abilities on a short-ish cooldown, like Prayer of Mending, like Circle of Healing, waiting for the Healing Chorus, you know, Circle of Healing buff. You're then having this mini game of reducing the cooldown of your Sanctify and Serenity Holy Words, plus reminding yourself to use Prayer of Mending on cooldown, instacast, allowing you to be quite mobile and to have decent spot healing with your Flash Heal casts. So the spec overall plays well, it's nice to play, but just like Resto Druid, the numbers are just too small at the moment for Holy Priest, who is, however, in a worse position than both of them, is the overall worst performers throughout the entirety of the beta. Even in this latest round of tuning, whether the boss was in Mythic or in Heroic, Discipline Priest was overall the worst out of all of the healers. Now, of course, as you can see, their healing profile is hilarious. You know, when you compare it to a Resto Druid, which is very straight, a Holy Priest has slightly more peaks, but their overall healing is still fine. Restoration Shaman, very high default healing without too many peaks of healing, besides a few powerful cooldown combines together. Also Holy Paladin, also very, very consistent healing. Discipline is, you know, the unique healer with gigantic burst. Right now, they are having a few problems making this burst work, as most of the Discipline Priests right now are playing around Void Weaver with Void Bolt and Entropic Rift. Doesn't work too well, plus their spikes of damage in between their cooldowns are quite far apart, which makes them have by far the worst consistent healing out of all of the healers. It's very, very low. It's practically, you know, DPS level when they're not placing down their atonements. And if we were to make a TLDR, there just aren't enough cycles of burst damage for Discipline to gain max advantage in a raid. You know, if the bosses are not like Smolderon, where you have an Absorb Shield with massive healing required every 30 seconds, where the Discipline Priest can rotate every 30 seconds their atonement spreading, then this is just too weak in a fight to work and to have very good healing. Of course, we can also say, you know, a word for Discipline, because it is still the worst one to play in a beta, because you don't know the bosses. Half of your add-ons are broken, so getting used to the ramps of damage and your timers required for bosses when you're testing in the beta is much harder. You know, it's much easier to just play Holy Paladin, randomly cast Holy Shock on anyone who is at lower than 80% HP, then continue to spot heal anyone below 80 or so % HP with Eternal Flame, and do very good consistent healing. The argument is a bit more, you know, complex for Discipline, who has a much harder time properly healing when it comes to a beta. So yes, they are the worst right now. Yes, they need more consistent healing in between their spikes of healing, or at the very least they need ways to have their burst happen slightly more often than just once a minute, especially if the fight has too much rot damage. Or in this case, you might perfectly be okay in saying, well, you have two healing specs in the same class for a reason. Some fights with big burst will be just great for Discipline during progression. Barrier will also be fantastic for dealing with high spikes of damage, and then other fights with consistent healing, you might simply be better just respecking to Holy Priest for more consistent healing than just staying as Discipline, for example. But we can still give them, you know, a bit of a bump in here. They would probably be closer to here if they actually could properly ramp with knowledge of a fight in the beta, compared to all of these other specs who have far fewer issues in that regard. But these have been so far the updated results of the last couple of days of beta testing, both from the heroic bosses as well as the 3 mythic bosses fought in the beta testing so far. So not much has moved since a couple of weeks ago, even after the Holy Paladin nerf. Holy Paladin and Mistweaver are still the best performers. Now we can say they are being practically matched, evened out by Preservation Evoker. Restoration Shaman is still the gatekeeper in the mid though, pending their changes coming in a few days, and then at the bottom you have Holy Priest and Restoration Druid, mostly in need of just some numbers bumps and buffs, and then Discipline Priest at the very bottom, likely needing a combination of more than just a few numbers being increased to make them stronger, but also being able to know the fight better, since their ramp requires way more knowledge of a fight than most of the other healers. So this is the, so far, recap of the performance of the specs in a raiding environment for the beta of the War Within. Waiting, of course, a few days for the pending changes of Restoration Shaman. That's how we are leaving each other on this Saturday. We are, of course, now thanking everyone for having watched the video, as well as for any more shows of support, like liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, 32 degrees with quite high humidity. I'm gonna say it's not too good.